Anjelica Huston's famous father, John, had his fair share of illicit trysts, but one day he went too far. He started sleeping with his daughter's friend, Zoe Salas, and Anjelica found out in an utterly brutal way. The daughter of legendary Hollywood director John Huston and prima ballerina Enrica Soma, Anjelica was born into a world of glamour and privilege, but her childhood hardly reflected that. When she was born, her father was in Uganda making a film, and it took 3 days for the news to reach him. When it did, he was indifferent. This type of distance, physical or otherwise, would come to define her family dynamic and her relationships. Within a year of her birth, Anjelica's father dealt her mother a devastating blow. He not only refused to cast her in his film Moulin Rouge, he also had an affair with the woman he did cast. He avoided Soma and the kids for months at a time, and engaged in multiple affairs over the years. Anjelica's mother moved her and her brother Tony from Ireland to London in 1960, and while her father entertained a cavalcade of girlfriends, actresses, socialites, novelists and diplomats, her mother had been carrying on an affair with a married man, and gave birth to a daughter, Allegra, in 1964. Anjelica doted on Allegra and had a special bond with her, but life would test that bond in more ways than one. When Anjelica was still in school, fate came knocking at her door. Franco Zeffirelli was adapting Romeo and Juliet, and producers were looking for their Juliet at her school. She wanted to audition, but her father had other ideas. If she was going to launch her career, it would be in one of his movies, 1969's A Walk with Love and Death. It turned out to be a mistake. Not only was making the movie with her father miserable, but critics panned her performance. She spent her high school years skipping class to hang out with boys. Meanwhile, her mother, Enrica Soma, spent most of her time mourning the failed relationship that had produced Allegra. Late one night, one of her mother's friends shook Anjelica awake with heartbreaking news. Her mother had been killed in a car crash while on a trip in France. She was just 39. Instantly, Anjelica's whole world changed. She fled to New York, instantly beginning a new chapter of her life. Harper's Bazaar wanted to take her photo before the release of the film she'd made with her father. They matched her with one of fashion's most in-demand, but also erratic and provocative photographers, Bob Richardson. Instantly, he drew her into his world, reassuring her of his impending separation from his wife and telling her they belonged together. She didn't know it, but she was in way over her head. She may have lost the unconditional love of her mother, but the constant shower of attention from Richardson helped her feel safe again. The age difference reflected that of her parents when they'd met. He was 42 to her 18. Richardson had a drug problem, had been institutionalized before, and his previous marriage had broken down after he and his wife began swinging. Despite the poor reviews for her first film, the world had taken notice of Anjelica Huston, and she was soon in demand as a model and actress. Not so coincidentally, the cracks in her relationship with Richardson began to show. Once, after she briefly left to make an appearance on The Tonight Show, Richardson tore apart all of her belongings in the hotel room they shared, just because she'd committed the offence of not unpacking her suitcases. Anjelica's father insisted that she and Richardson join him on a fishing trip in Mexico, along with his new fiancée, Cece. Tensions were high, and one night, after Anjelica went for a drink with her father, Bob retaliated by throwing a bottle at her head when she came back to the room. It was the final straw. When they arrived back in Los Angeles, Huston told him that it was over. Shaken from the terror she'd felt over 3 years of living with Richardson, Huston retreated to Cece's home in the Pacific Palisades, where she rode horses, spent time in nature, and tried to avoid the blatant fix-ups that her father's fiancé subjected her to. That is, until she was invited to a party hosted by a popular young actor by the name of Jack Nicholson. Still fresh from her breakup, the pair nonetheless began dating, but it wasn't exactly smooth sailing. Anjelica's modelling career was flourishing, as was Jack's acting, which meant they had to briefly go long distance while he made a film and she worked in London. Days after they first parted ways, Anjelica made a disturbing discovery. One of her friends confessed to sleeping with Jack mere hours after she'd left him for the airport. The smooth-tongued actor managed to talk his way out of it this time, but it would become a dark omen for the future of their relationship. From then on, whenever Anjelica suspected that Jack was cheating, she was able to find evidence of it. He wasn't exactly the most fastidious with his affairs, but still, she put up with it. Anjelica knew she wanted to try her hand at acting again, but after the failure of her one and only film, she was hesitant. She refused to get by on nepotism, but on top of her dad's legend status, she also happened to be dating Hollywood's biggest star. In 1976, Jack left Anjelica in LA and went to New York on a boys' trip. During this time, she found herself at a party where troubled star Ryan O'Neal approached her. When Jack returned home a few days later, Anjelica gave him the shock of a lifetime. She told him that she was in love with O'Neal and was leaving him. She finally decided to try her hand at film acting, hoping to get a part in The Last Tycoon, only to be brutally shut down by director Elia Kazan, who told her that she wasn't beautiful enough for the leading role she wanted, but that he'd cast her as another character's rejected date. She appeared in the star-studded cast alongside a familiar face, none other than her ex, Jack Nicholson. Soon enough, she was seeing both him and Ryan O'Neal. She described life with O'Neal as a Jekyll and Hyde situation. Ryan was physically abusive throughout their relationship, and it escalated one night when he headbutted her because he couldn't find her in the middle of a party. Anjelica fled to an upstairs bathroom, but O'Neal followed her and continued to hit her. She had no one to look to for guidance. She ended up getting help from an unlikely source, her 13-year-old half-sister, Allegra, who had just 2 words for Anjelica: leave him. After the disappointment of The Last Tycoon, Anjelica took a 5-year hiatus from film, but when her friend Bob Raffleson offered her a part in another movie Jack Nicholson was starring in, The Postman Always Rings Twice, she jumped at the chance. And it didn't hurt that she'd then be able to keep an eye on Jack as he acted opposite Hollywood's newest blonde, Jessica Lange. She was bothered that her connections had helped her get the part, but she didn't have much time to dwell on it. Not long after she finished her part in the film, she was involved in a terrifying car accident. Without her seatbelt on, she was thrown into the windshield, and doctors had to operate on her nose and face. As awful as the accident was, it had an unexpected side effect. It made her realise that she spent too much of her time waiting for things to happen, and that it was time to break that habit. Anjelica Huston had spent the first 30 years of her life looking for love, first with her family and then in romantic relationships. But now she wanted something for herself. She wanted to act, without relying on her father or Jack Nicholson or their friends for parts. And act she did. The roles weren't large and the films weren't massive successes, but she took lessons and got by on her own. Then a friend passed her a book that he wanted to adapt. He thought she'd be great in the lead role. She was thrilled, but there was a twist. The book was called Pritzi's Honour, and not only did he want Anjelica Huston to play the female lead, he wanted to cast Jack Nicholson as the male lead and get her father to direct. At first she refused, but eventually she agreed to appear, only to be met with a brutal insult. When she asked for more money than the base rate, her agent called the producer only for him to reply that she had no talent, and the only reason they were having the conversation was because her boyfriend was the star and her father was the director. The old Anjelica Huston would have taken the insults to heart and retreated, but the new Anjelica decided she'd make him eat his words, and that's exactly what she did. Of the 8 Oscar nominations that Prizzi's Honor got, there was only one win.
Anjelica Huston and Prizzi's Honor!
After her speech, she ran from the stage back to her father, instead of exiting to the press room. The proud dad had tears streaming down his face as his daughter rushed over to greet and thank him. For the first time, Anjelica was able to bask in her own success. In the 80s, John Huston began working on a film called The Dead, and he wanted it to be a family affair. Anjelica's older brother Tony had secretly written the script. As her father was ailing and needed to have oxygen tanks pretty much everywhere he went, producers and the Huston family moved heaven and earth to make it happen. The stress of the production and watching her father direct in such poor health had an adverse effect on Anjelica's health, and she developed Epstein-Barr syndrome. Not long after completing The Dead, John Huston fell even more ill than he already was. Confined to a hospital bed, Anjelica visited him daily. One evening she bid him farewell and promised to come back the next day. Sadly, he died before she could see him again. He was 81 years old. Despite their distance during her childhood, he had since become a steady presence in her life. Anjelica reeled from the loss. She and Nicholson had drifted apart throughout the 80s, and by 1990, they had finally decided to call it quits. After the breakup, Anjelica went to Cannes to act as a juror at the festival. Within hours of her arrival, she had a new suitor, Prince Albert of Monaco. While she did enjoy one date with him, it wasn't the prince who ended up giving Anjelica her happily ever after. Like something out of a rom-com, one of her friends wanted to fix her up with a sculptor named Robert Graham. Anjelica and Robert began dating and fell in love, and with this newfound happiness came professional success as well. Producers approached Anjelica with a role that had been her dream nearly her entire life.
Children, what are you doing?
I'm going to electrocute him.
I said no.
Please?
Oh, all right.
As a child, Anjelica had read Addams Family cartoons and fantasized about playing Morticia. As glamorous as it seems, playing Morticia Addams does not sound fun. Her makeup artist glued fabric tabs to her face that she'd then taped to the back of her skull, constricting her whole head and resulting in intense headaches and rashes. Luckily, her hard work paid off, and not only was The Addams Family a huge success, it also became a beloved family classic, defined at least in part by her iconic performance. When Anjelica brought Robert Graham to Ireland to visit her childhood home, he surprised her on one of their last days there by proposing. In 1992 they were married, and Anjelica was ecstatic to have finally found lasting love. But there was one piece of the puzzle missing. She hadn't put that much thought into having children. After all, her relationships had frequently been tumultuous. After breaking up with Jack Nicholson, she finally tried to address why she'd never gotten pregnant, and made a devastating discovery. Doctors diagnosed her with endometriosis and told her that it was unlikely she'd ever have kids, which left her feeling inadequate and angry. After her marriage to Robert Graham, they made attempts at fertility treatments, but sadly nothing worked. Without the looming legacy of her father or Jack holding her back, Anjelica found untold professional success in the 90s. She appeared in more films, a TV miniseries, and even began directing. She became the kind of natural A-lister she'd been surrounded by her whole life. She appeared alongside an all-star cast in the critically acclaimed The Royal Tenenbaums, but the set of the film was notoriously dysfunctional, and Huston later revealed her disturbing side of the story. As she tells it, veteran actor Gene Hackman was a vicious presence on the shoot, and he often hurled insults at the young director Wes Anderson. Huston confessed that it got so bad that she and Bill Murray would have to step in to protect Anderson, with Murray even coming in on his days off to make sure nothing happened. You'd think that would have bonded them together, but not quite. The next time Murray and Huston worked together on Wes Anderson's film The Life Aquatic, Murray was reportedly extremely rude to her. Apparently on the first week of the shoot he invited the entire cast to dinner, except Anjelica. But he wasn't her only Hollywood enemy. Reportedly, Huston's on the wrong end of a one-sided feud with one of the most powerful women in show business, Oprah. Ever since Huston beat out Oprah's performance in The Colour Purple and bagged her first Oscar, she claims Oprah has shunned her. Anjelica Huston finally found her storybook ending with sculptor Robert Graham, but like so many of her other relationships, tragedy made its way into her life. In 2007, Robert fell ill. 6 months later, he died, leaving Anjelica a widow. The loss devastated her. While she hasn't moved on romantically, she did find solace in making the TV show Smash, and by writing 2 memoirs, one of which covered not only her love story with Robert, but the depths of her childhood. Though they eventually reconciled, there was one event from Anjelica Huston's childhood with her father that she never forgot, and took a long time to forgive. John Huston had his fair share of illicit trysts, frequently cheating on Anjelica's mother. But one time he went way too far. He started sleeping with his teen daughter's friend, Zoe Salas. When John Huston broke the news to Anjelica about his affair with her friend, he did it in a brutal way, by telling her she now had a baby half-brother. That child, actor Danny Huston, later became a beloved part of the Huston family. But it took years for Anjelica to accept him and Zoe into her family. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more videos.